Welcome. I'm Darren Guerra with the Kirkwood Center, and the Kirkwood Center is where we highlight the best of Christian scholarship to help equip the local church and engage the culture. And today I'm joined by Tim Milosch, my colleague at Biola, and Tim is going to help us think through the war in Ukraine. How should the church think about the war in Ukraine? How do we apply the just war tradition to the Ukrainian conflict? And let me have Tim introduce himself. Tim, what are you up to these days?
Hi, Darren. Great to be on here. And thanks to the Kirkwood Center for hosting these kind of conversations. They're really important. I do quite a lot, and I do quite a lot specifically in the realm of international relations and foreign policy. So in my work at Biola University, I do several things there, but relevant to this discussion, I'm an adjunct faculty member in the political science department where I get to work with Dr. Guerra and our mutual friend and colleague, Scott Waller. And there I teach courses on foreign policy, international relations, national security. So we talk about things like the Ukraine war quite a bit. And then I also podcast and write on Substack at Tim Talks Politics, where I cover all this stuff some more because I am just deeply, deeply fascinated by this stuff. And then in my oodles of spare time, I'm also a contributing editor for Providence Magazine, publication by the Institute for Research for Religion and Democracy. And they are a unique publication in American media in general, but even in Christian media, and that Providence Magazine works specifically within the just war tradition to equip Christians with the resources and means and thought to think through international affairs and conflict and things of that nature. So I'm really a real pleasure to be a part of that work.
Well, and I'm glad you're a part of it as well, and I'm really glad you made time to talk with us today, Tim. And so, speaking of Providence, that's kind of where I want to stop off because there's a lot of ways we could on-ramps onto the Ukraine issue. But I think one unique way that you can add to this discussion is you wrote a piece for Providence on the application of the just war tradition to the Ukraine conflict in recent weeks, and that resulted in a response from the editor of Providence, Mark Tully, who's a great a thinker in his own right, and critiquing your piece, and then they allowed you to respond to Mark Tully as well. And so one thing on the outset, I just applaud Providence for engaging in kind of open dialogue in their pages. I just don't think there's a lot of that going on these days. I think a lot of journalistic outlets or even scholarly outlets just don't allow open, honest dialogue to happen. Mm-hmm. And so I applaud Providence for doing that. And just one side note, one of my, I don't know if you call it a hobby horse, is I think people overlook the fact that the Christian church is one of the few places you can have this because they have the resources to have open dialogue. If you believe that there is a higher moral order that we are accountable to, then we want to get it right, and we want to challenge each other to get it right. And once you step outside of that framework, everything just becomes about power, and power would say, no, you don't allow people to have a platform on your platform. You don't engage them honestly. You dominate, you subdue, right? That's the world of power. And the Christian church and the Christian politics should not be about domination. It should be about dialogue, should be about thinking carefully through these things. Yeah. So I applaud Providence for that. I'm glad that you were engaged in this debate with Mark Tully. And so with that introduction, so what was in your article? How did it relate to the Ukrainian issue? And let's get the ball rolling there.
Yeah, so I wrote the article actually engaging with another conversation that had been happening in Providence in the weeks prior, and that was a series of articles that were actually based on a series of talks hosted by the Institute for Religion and Democracy, wherein another scholar had proposed that we needed to expand the just war framework to something that he called just statecraft, which I think would be very intriguing for you, Darren, since you teach a course on statesmanship.
I do.
And the basic idea here was, how do we apply just war thinking across the entire domain of national power? So in the national security space, in the foreign policy space, practitioners and scholars alike often refer to the DIME acronym, DIME, and they look at these as the four main categories of national power: diplomacy, information and intelligence, military, and economic. And basically the argument goes is that all four of these levers or domains of power deployed by nation states to advance their foreign policy objectives. So, the discussion in Providence was, if just statecraft is essentially an expansion or an addition to just war theory, and broadening its scope to include things beyond the immediate run-up and conduct of a war, but to how a state deploys its power even in peacetime. So I found that really interesting. And so when we had the now infamous Oval Office meltdown between President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine and President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance a few weeks ago, I felt like that would be a really good test case of this just statecraft proposition. And the reason I thought that was because, well, we had a war, the Ukraine war, but in that moment in the Oval Office, we didn't have necessarily a military component there, because America is not a belligerent in this war, at least not in the traditional sense. We don't have boots on the ground. We are obviously backing Ukraine. We're sending a lot of weapons and munition, and we're sharing intelligence. We're assisting them in a host of other ways. In fact, we're assisting them in diplomacy, intelligence and information sharing, military aid, and in economic aid. We are assisting Ukraine across the whole DIME spectrum. And so I thought, well, this is a good test case, a good case study of what just statecraft as a framework could look like in assessing not just this moment of Ukraine-American relations, but also assessing even the President Trump's pitch for some kind of peace deal. So that was the first thing. I was thinking of engaging with that particular discussion, and looking at this particular moment as a relevant case study. But then the other component of it was that I found myself a little surprised by the vehemence with which the Trump administration was attacked for even suggesting that a peace deal or a ceasefire in Ukraine was possible. And the fact that they would be willing to pursue it to the extent of appearing to strong arm the Ukrainians into one. Now, admittedly, and we can get into like the particulars of this, the Oval Office meeting, the meltdown that occurred, what I've been at pains to tell people is those kinds of flare-ups occur regularly in diplomatic relations, even among friends and allies. The unique moment for this particular one was that it happened in front of a lot of cameras and millions of viewers. Right. And that's what made it feel unique. That's what made it feel like everything was coming apart and falling apart. And that's not entirely true, as events in the 2 weeks following that demonstrated. So I had two things I was trying to do. I was asking a question of like, is this a case study for just statecraft as a viable framework for understanding conflict and navigating conflict with wisdom and prudence? And how do we, like, why is there such a anger at even just the mere thought of suggesting, or even just asking a question, can we do a ceasefire and what would that look like? And so I found in just war theory that in the discussions around the American support for the Ukrainian war effort, I found that there'd been a lot of appeal to just war theory, rightfully so. It is a just war. I don't think you'll find anybody who will say it's not. It has a just cause. They've been invaded by an aggressor nation. This is like this is like the clearest cut example of what a legitimate just war just cause war looks like, is you are invaded, you are attacked, right? Like that's pretty legit. And then you also have a legitimate authority declaring the war, the government of Ukraine. Like it's just completely valid. But what seemed to be a surprise to me was that the element of just war theory that was getting overlooked was probability of success, which, as I was listening to the arguments that Vice President Vance, President Trump were making, both to Zelensky, but also what they made to, like, just in their public discussion on the war, is they were essentially appealing to that part of the tradition. Now, they weren't saying it that way. They weren't saying, I doubt President Trump is a just war theorist in any way, shape, or form, but they were essentially making that acknowledgement, like, hey, we have to think about we have to think about whether or not there's a probability of success. Now, of course, success in what way? And their basic framework has been success as defined by Ukraine. So President Zelensky has generally defined success in the war as recapturing land lost to Russia, and or significant security guarantees, and or membership in NATO, the European Union, etc. All of which have been generally seen and stated by the Russians as non-starters on any peace agreement. So the position of, it seemed, of Trump and Vance was, well, at this current rate at which we're supporting Ukraine, they're not able to progress towards their war aims. And it's the stated policy of the Biden administration and the Trump administration that Ukraine won't be going into NATO. So where do we go from here? Like, do we have probability of success under these terms? Their answer is no, we don't. And so we need to think about, at that point, we need to think about a diplomatic off-ramp here. And it really just seemed to be like they were making the opening argument for pursuing peace on the basis of not having a pathway towards a reasonable probability of success. To me, that seemed very straightforward. That seemed very commonsensical. And so I was a little surprised to see a major division open up among just general scholars in the field of foreign policy and international relations, but even just among Christian observers on this matter. And it really came down to, do we just continue to support Ukraine with just, open-ended military aid as is, or are we just abandoning them completely? It was really an all or nothing proposition, which I wasn't picking up in the policy and diplomacy discussion, but that really seemed to be kind of how the conversation polarized. And so I thought there really does need to be a reminder to people that, you could still lose a just war. And so that's right. Why you contemplate probability of success. And so we need to re-engage this piece of the discussion.
Yeah, so there has to be some prudential judgment as to how are you using your resources, how are you able to continue fighting, those kind of prudential judgments that once you cross the moral threshold, then there's some these type of judgments being made. So okay, so that makes sense. So the editor of Providence, Mark Tully, had some concerns about this, I guess, and he wrote a response piece. So what were his concerns about your framework or the way you approach this?
I'll confess, when I first read his article, because he was responding not just to me, but also to a article that Rusty similarly, out of First Things, that similarly, that made a similar appeal, I should just say. So he was responding to both of us, and when I first read it, I actually wasn't sure if he was responding to me at all, because I wasn't seeing the direct connections to my argument. But I think if I were to sum it up, he was basically arguing that just because a country could lose or has a low probability of success doesn't mean, under just war teaching, they should back down in the face of aggression. That just war teaching allows a smaller, weaker country to fight back against an aggressor, which I would thoroughly agree with, and he has a ton of historical examples of this.
Yeah.
A lot of good varied examples, I might add. And so I kind of generally saw that as somewhat non-responsive to the argument, but at the same time relevant, because it's a helpful way of allowing me to say, yeah, that's not what I'm saying at all. And this is, I think, is relevant for because for advocates of a peace deal, for American advocates who have generally backed the Trump administration's ceasefire deal, they generally do tend to fall into this category of, they'll say things like, Ukraine's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Why are we supporting this? They're for sure going to get knocked around, and they're going to lose eventually. Why are we backing a loser? And I think that general view of Ukraine is absolutely wrong. It is wrong on multiple levels, and it's unjust. I mean, just because a country is smaller and weaker than the aggressor doesn't mean that they just give in and throw themselves down there. And then, two, the whole canard about Ukraine being a corrupt country does not at all account, like there's no graciousness in that at all. There's no civility in it. It does not account for the fact that Ukraine is a country that has made huge strides in democratization and developing a liberal democracy. And they're making huge strides in a single generation after multiple generations of communist oppression. You cannot expect them to just immediately be a flourishing liberal democracy with total transparency and no corruption, et cetera, just one generation after multiple generations of communism. So,
yeah, and that does
go ahead.
Open up the question of, so are only countries that are pure as the driven snow worth defending? I mean, there, as you correctly point out, there are stages of development. There are countries at various stages of levels of corruption and whatnot. At what point does that trigger? The implication seems to be at some point a country forgoes its right to defend itself because of its internal corruption, and that doesn't seem to follow for most reasonable people.
Exactly. And so I think, this line of argumentation, and you typically see it in like YouTube comments and on X and like social media. So, and I've actually heard this in just general conversation though, too. So it's not like I'm picking up on the dregs of the internet to see this. This has been a part of the conservative support for Donald Trump's peace diplomacy, and I think it's wrong. So I do think Mark Tully was responding to that particular concern, and it's not an irrelevant concern. That is a part of the debate, but that also happens to be where Mark and I are in total agreement. Ukraine has every right to defend itself. They are worthy of that defense, and they're worthy of our support in that defense. That is not to suggest that pursuing peace somehow means that we've discounted that, I think, is silly.
And I think you would agree with this. And Tully, I think, is sensitive to that. You do hear folks and some on the right making kind of classic appeasement arguments, right?
Yeah.
And you did hear the Chamberlain side during leading up to World War II and after the invasion of Poland, even within the Churchill government. I'm forgetting the Lord's name, the politician's name, but he was saying, look, we can't fight this. We don't have a chance of success. We should sue Hitler for peace on the best terms we can get. And you do hear some people making those arguments, and Tully was sensitive to that and saying, look, we can't just give in to classic appeasement. And that's where I think you're right. He mentions Belgium in 1914, Britain in 1940, Poland in 39, et cetera, and so, yeah, that makes sense. But your response is, but I'm not making that argument. There's within the tradition that you don't have to go to the appeasement wing to make prudential judgments about how to employ force in these situations, right?
Right, and that's where we get to weighing the more particular piece of Tully's critique that does come, is where he actually starts weighing the idea of like, well, does Ukraine have a probability of success? And I think this is where there's a more substantive debate between us, because it starts looking at like, hey, what are the variables that determine probability of success? So he lists off several, such as the geographic size of Ukraine, the motivation of the population, the ability of Ukraine to sustain itself, not just with outside military aid, but its growing military industrial complex, the casualties of Russia, whether or not the Russian population is backing the war effort. And these are all variables worth considering. But I would argue, and he would say, and Tully's point was, it was also a characterization of how should Ukraine respond to peace terms from Russia, and he was generally characterizing any peace agreement as being disadvantageous to Ukraine. And I think there was an implication there that any Trump brokered agreement is going to be disadvantageous to Ukraine, and this disadvantageous to Ukraine and advantageous to Russia. Which I think we also disagree on. So I'll address both those points. One, we don't really know what shape a ceasefire agreement will take. We're 2-3 weeks past that Oval Office meltdown, and we're still in the early stages of talking through the pieces of a ceasefire. We have a ceasefire framework that the Ukrainians agreed to with the Americans, but now the Russians want to speak into this, and all the while, both Ukraine and Russia are continuing to hammer each other with drones and missiles to make sure the other gets the message that they're not engaging in discussions because they're weak and ready to give in. So, I mean, we're still in the fog of war here. And 3 weeks ago, when we had this Oval Office meltdown, like that was in the very earliest stages of what a deal could look like. So I think there is an assumption among the kind of like Ukraine war observing class. There's an assumption that they know what a deal is going to look like, and that deal is just going to be disadvantageous to Ukraine, and therefore there's no need to proceed further. And I just think that's wrong on multiple levels. Not the least of which is, we're not in all these meetings. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors. We're in the very earliest stages of this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think that that's something of a non sequitur to begin with. But then on the point of variables related to how do you assess probability of success, I think those are worth considering. You actually have to contemplate, hey, which of these variables is actually relevant here? One, but two, these variables that Mark lists in his article, they're variables for Ukraine to consider, such as the size of the country. They're either variables that are more relevant to Ukraine's decision to keep fighting, or variables that we just actually don't have any information on, such as, does the public support Vladimir Putin in Russia? We actually just have no idea. There's like no idea about what that looks like. So it's hard to assess that, and so should even be part of that. Part of that discussion becomes, I think, a troublesome variable. So I really engaged in my response to Tully with that question of like, hey, which variables should we be considering when we are asking the question, is it prudent to continue the American policy of military support for Ukraine? And by military, I just mean supporting their war effort, because this includes diplomatic, intelligence, and economic aid as well. Do we continue our current policy of supporting Ukraine in their war effort implicitly towards Ukraine's maximalist war aims, given facts on the ground? So the variables that Tully outlined were relevant for Ukraine, making that determination for itself. But as a sponsor of Ukraine, we have a different set of variables we have to consider. And that's the argument I was trying to make is, we can't make, as much as we're supporting Ukraine in their war, it is still their war. And I think there's a certain blending of the war that's been unhelpful in the American discussion, where Ukraine's war has somehow become our war. And we need to be very, very careful of that, not the least of which is that poses a real risk to our relations and potential conflict escalation between us and Russia. So we have to be mindful of that. So given that context, we then have to think about, okay, what are the variables America needs to consider when it comes to continuing this policy of supporting the Ukrainian war effort? And I think one of the basic variables is Ukraine taking the policy steps necessary to achieve their war aims? And the answer there is not entirely. This is something that a lot of average Americans are unaware of, but the entire military age population of Ukraine has not been mobilized for this war. Rather, the Zelensky government has chosen to mobilize the older age cohorts while holding back the younger cohorts. And it's the argument has generally been a preservation of future generations and, preserve the young, put the old forward. Okay. And maybe they really do think that. Maybe that's actually the case. But there's been some really helpful analysis suggesting that, if that's the case, then this probably isn't as existential a conflict as Zelensky often portrays it. So that's
interesting. Yeah, if you're not and I wasn't aware of that. If you're not mobilizing the entire military age population, I mean that would be the logical thing to do if you felt an impending collapse of your society or a takeover. Right. We're going to put everybody up there that we can. I was not aware that there was this demarcation between the old and young.
Yeah, no, there really has been, and they're starting to move towards a broader generalization as some of their manpower shortages have started to bite. But part of the reason, then this partly explains why they haven't been able to make progress on the ground. They haven't been bringing as many men to the fight as they could. And all the number of heavy arms and armaments and F-16s and tanks we can give them isn't going to change that. You need to put crews in those pieces. So that's one problem. The other problem is that's been noted is that in organizing new military units, there's essentially two ways you can fight a war. You can basically just recruit and train a bunch of people and then use them as replacements for casualties in units that already exist, or you can create brand new units. And usually you get a hybrid of that. So relevant experience here for Americans is World War II, where we had to massively mobilize our population to prepare for a war on two fronts. And you actually saw America do both. We stood up new units because we had a deep enough manpower pool. We stood up new units, new organizations. After World War II, we stood up a whole new branch of the military in the form of the Air Force. We totally did the new unit thing, but we also did the replacement thing. So a great example of this is for those of your listeners who are familiar with the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers and the Stephen Ambrose book that it's built on. There's a whole episode dedicated to, it's titled Replacements. And the statistic that got Ambrose's attention that led him to write the story of Easy Company was the fact that this was a company that suffered over 100% casualties in World War II. And that immediately gets someone's attention. It's like, wait, how does a unit continue to exist in suffering 100% casualties? Does that mean all the original members die? Well, no, a lot of the original members lived. And how's that happen? Well, it was because they were getting replacements. It was because they were getting restocked and brought up to full manpower at different points as the war went on. So you can do both of these things, and there's arguments for and against both. If you put replacements in, it can more quickly ramp them up to combat experience because they're learning on the field with people who already have combat experience. But they also they do tend to have higher casualty rates because they're the new guys.
Right.
If you stand up an entirely new unit, you do have the advantage of being able to train them on new weapon systems, which is why Ukraine has been standing up a lot of new units, because they're getting trained on a lot of new systems they're getting from America and European countries. And that was probably a big part of the thinking. But the problem is when you send the new units into combat, they obviously have a learning curve. They have a learning curve, and that learning curve can be very deadly depending on the situation. So what we've seen in Ukraine is a preference for standing up new units as opposed to filling existing combat experience units with replacements. This has reduced combat effectiveness. So on paper, they have a lot of new units in the field, but the combat effectiveness of those units has been diminished over time. So diminishing returns does set in. And so these are just like strategic planning errors that Ukraine has made. And they've made it as a function of our support for them. It's not that they've made it independent of our support. They've made those errors as a function of our support for them. They've stood up new units so that they can come train in America on American systems, which they take back into battle, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's one such instance. The other point to point out is we're in a stalemate with the amount of aid we've given them. So if we're going to break out of this stalemate, does that mean we need to give Ukraine more? The Trump administration has clearly drawn the conclusion of we're not going to do that. So either Europe has to step in, or we need to sue for peace. We need to figure something out.
Yeah, and maybe you can say a few things about the whole kind of overarching kind of where we are geopolitically, right? I mean, is it fair to say that post World War II, the U.S. found itself in a position to basically underwrite global security, for lack of a better term? They were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. The U.S. financially and militarily underwrote the Western response to that. And in Europe, you had NATO. You had the European countries basically under the American defense umbrella, so to speak. And that has carried on for, 70, 80 years, right? And so now here we are in 2025. Ukraine is expecting European help. Ukraine is expecting American help. And America has been before the invasion of Ukraine, was reevaluating, right? What should our relationship to NATO, to Europe be? And one of the outstanding issues has been, do we have the financial or military resources to underwrite this whole thing? Should the Europeans be paying more of their fair share and taking more of a leadership role in these matters? And for decades, the U.S. has said we'll pay the bills, but also we get to call the shots. And there's some advantages to that, right? You pay the bills, you call the shots. You're in the catbird seat, as they say. But now Americans are starting like, can we afford to pay the bills? Do we want to call the shots? And there's some pluses and minuses to that. But seems, I guess, long and short of what I'm trying to say, there's some reevaluation going on. And that's at the global strategic level, but does have implications for, all right, how much, I mean, if Europe's not going to step up to the table, or maybe they do need to step up to the table and take more of a regional security role vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia. Anyways, there's a whole lot going on there that I think often gets missed.
Yeah, I think the question that is, if we put it back in the just war theory framework, the question about probability of success has to come back down to concrete realities. And the concrete reality is what you're alluding to, is that the security situation in Europe over the last several decades has been one that's underwritten by the United States, but especially in the aftermath or in the context of September 11th and the global war on terror and American missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, the security in Europe was generally taken for granted. The security status quo in Europe was taken for granted. in such a way that when Russia made its moves on Ukraine in 2014, because this is really when that war started. The war did not start in 2022. It started in 2014.
Yeah, fair enough.
And when that war started, America and its European allies were not ready. They just weren't. And that's why we got the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. That's why Crimea remains in Russian hands. That's why Putin was not just somewhat favorably placed for his invasion in 2022, but why he was encouraged by his chances. He really thought that Europe and America would not come to Ukraine's rescue. At least that seems to be the case. Now, that was a major strategic misread by Russia and Vladimir Putin in particular. But he wasn't entirely wrong, because what we're seeing is that there seem to be, and this isn't just unique to the Trump administration, this is bipartisan, there's an upper limit on the aid that America and Europe are willing to give and the manner in which they give it to Ukraine. And so what we have, and so in this way, we're kind of like stuck with this stalemate. And the way I put it in my reply to Tully is that the objective of American diplomacy has become the need to convince Ukraine that they cannot win, at least at the level of the maximalist aims that Zelensky has outlined. In other words, you're not going to, at the current rate of things, you're not going to win back your lost territory. Even if we hold Crimea out and you just want the rest of the Donbass back, or if you want to just get back to the pre-invasion line of contact, like, you're not getting there. So you're not getting that. So we have to persuade Ukraine of that. But we also have to persuade Russia that Ukraine can't lose, because what we can't lose sight of is Putin's maximalist war aim was to install a puppet government in Ukraine, if not absorb Ukraine entirely into the Russian Federation, at the very least to control it in an imperial way where a friendly government was there, much like they do Belarus. Yeah. And so the maximalist war aim of Putin can't be met, and the maximalist war aim of Ukraine can't be met. Hence, we have a stalemate. And so that's, I think, the question that we need to consider when thinking about, like, okay, if you're Europe and America, if you're America who has long underwritten European security, is a stalemate your best option? So you have to think, okay, how do we maintain that stalemate? Like, do we maintain that stalemate by active support of an ongoing war? Or is it better to maintain a stalemate with a open-ended ceasefire? That's kind of the choice there, and no one likes that choice, and I agree. It's a terrible choice, but it's a choice we've made before. And the relevant example, so you mentioned Chamberlain and isolationism and kind of like the pre-World War II diplomacy in Europe that resulted in the Munich conference. Daryl Charles, friend and colleague, person we both know and who has spoken at Biola, he's actually written another article on Providence where he's kind of talked about Munich as a parallel to the Trump administration's diplomacy on Ukraine. I don't think it's a good example. I do respectfully disagree with Daryl, though I highly respect him and his scholarship. I do think he's wrong on this one, because one, if the war started in 2014, that means Ukraine already had its Munich moment. It was when Crimea was taken, America and Europe did nothing, or gave empty promises and bad agreements in the form of Minsk I, Minsk II. So Russia that was the music.
They took the Sudetenland, right?
That was the Munich moment.
And nobody did anything.
2022 was the Poland moment. So I think I think we got the parallels wrong there. I think the more accurate parallel, and I allude to this in my article responding to Tully, for America right now, trying to convince two warring parties that their war aims are both impractical and that they might have to settle for some kind of frozen conflict or stalemate. The example here is the Korean War, because that's exactly how we ended the Korean War. And I did a little background research just to make sure that I wasn't picking a bad historical example or parallel. And I found, this actually surprised me. I had known that discussions on a ceasefire continued for 1 to 2 years before we actually got the ceasefire agreement, and brutal fighting the entire time. But what I didn't realize was that the Truman administration, so the war starts in 1950, the Truman administration actually was trying to get to a ceasefire agreement as early as late 1950, before the war was even a year old. But they were opposed by a North Korean government and Kim Il-sung, who wanted to take control of the whole peninsula.
Right.
And they were opposed by a South Korean government that wanted to take the whole peninsula. And so the whole diplomatic scenario was very relevant. Like, we're backing South Korea. We were behind them all the way. We were going to defend them and protect them to a much greater degree than we're doing in Ukraine, I might add. But even then, we're saying, like, hey, you need to find an off-ramp. And no, we don't think we're going to get to that, because we are thinking globally about the threat of Russia. But as it turned out, we needed to be paying attention to China as well. Also sounds familiar to today. And essentially, we were trying to get both of these, maximally hard-charging parties to the table. And I think the takeaway here is, one, we did eventually get them to an agreement that neither of them liked. But two, turned out really well for our friend South Korea, which I think we can hold out as a promise to Ukraine. Like, hey, this might not be optimal, but it can go well. And then third, I would say too, is to remind listeners, like I said earlier, is like, we're still in the very early stages of this diplomacy around the ceasefire. It took 2 years from beginning to look for an off-ramp to actually getting to a ceasefire agreement in Korea. So, I think at that point, when in kind of circling back to this idea of probability of success, if we've concluded that the probability of achieving maximalist war aims is unlikely, given the security situation in Europe, given the geopolitical position, given economic conditions in the U.S. and Europe, then we need to look for the off-ramp. And I think that more or less puts us where the Truman administration found itself at the end of 1950. So then the question becomes, okay, what shape does that ceasefire have to look like? And that, we move out of just causes and just conduct of war to just peace. And I think there is a relevant discussion there. There's some real debate there. There are real concerns there that Ukraine might not get what it is after. But I think what we need to hold against that is the realization that Ukraine existing after a ceasefire agreement is signed means that Putin gets neither of his major war aims.
Right.
And so geostrategically, it still constitutes a loss for Russia, even if it's a ceasefire that the Ukrainians aren't happy with.
Yeah, no, that's good. And there's a lot there, but I think it's helpful to think, I myself do. World War II was such an imprint on the American mind and the American memory that we analogize almost everything to that. But and that's not all for the bad. That's really helpful and necessary sometimes. But there are other instances, even in American politics, and as you lay out the argument, and I'm glad you brought it up because I was going to ask you about that. Like in your piece, like that stood out to me. Like, well, Korea is an interesting example, and it does seem there are some touch points where that analogy may hold more sway in terms of the reality of the situation we find ourselves in. And as you say, Ukraine can look at South Korea these past decades and say, oh, that actually turned out pretty good for them, and not to mention reducing the loss of life, reducing the tensions, all these things. So, well, I think we're going to have to leave it there, Tim, but I really appreciate you taking time, walking us through these very complex situations. And I think, again, tying it into the Just War tradition and kind of hopefully helping the local church and Christians just think carefully about these things, not just rushing to judgment, not being fodder for the manipulative forces on either side. I mean, I look at the social media on either side of this question. I feel like they are manipulating me. How are they trying to manipulate the right's trying to manipulate me, the left's trying to manipulate, and so trying to navigate all the media manipulation is difficult. But you need to engage in gathering news and gathering information. So I really helpful for you, kind of walking us through that, giving us frameworks and helping Christians just kind of get up to speed. How do we think carefully about these things? And so just, again, thanks again for coming in.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Darren. Thank you.
And just as we're signing off here, just a reminder, the Kirkwood Center is where we highlight the best of Christian scholarship to help equip the local church to engage the culture. And so thanks for joining us, and look forward to talking next time. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Please take a moment to leave a review on your podcast app of choice. If this episode made you think of someone you know, please share it with them. If you want to get in touch with the Kirkwood Center, you can call or text us at 909-493-7799 or send us an email at contact@kirkwoodcenter.org. You can also visit our website at kirkwoodcenter.org. If you want to join the Theology and Ethics conversation and see more content, you can find the Kirkwood Center on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube and Substack. Until next week, my name is Anthony Costello. Thank you for listening to the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, God bless.